Hi there, welcome back to the channel. My name is Nicole with morningchores.com. Today I'm going to share a really fun video I thought it'd be fun to do, and that is my top 10 mistakes of what not to do in your garden. On the channel, we're always sharing tips on how to improve your gardening practices. I always like to show how to harvest things, how to grow things, how to plant things, but I thought it would be really fun and interesting to make a list of my top 10 mistakes that I've made in my gardening journey, and hopefully it will encourage you not to make these mistakes. I always look at gardening as a journey. It's something that we're continuously learning from. It's lots of trial and errors, and you are going to naturally make mistakes. But I think the key is to take those mistakes and use it as a learning opportunity. What can I do different? What could I change? There's always something to learn with gardening. The first mistake that you do not want to do, that I most certainly have done, and that is placing your garden in the wrong location. This is easy to do, especially if you are in a hurry to set up a garden. I really like to encourage people to live on your property for at least 1 year through all 4 seasons, because it helps give you an opportunity to learn your property, learn what kind of weather it is up against, where the weather is coming from. One thing I've learned on my property is that I have what's called microclimates. I have areas on my property that get slightly different weather than other locations on my property. For example, our house is up on a hill, and we have kind of this little valley down at the bottom of our property, and in that little valley it's always a little cooler. It gets much more dew in the morning, and it also gets more fog. So I have just learned that that space is really good for a forest, which there is a forest in part of that space. It's also good for plants that need cooler climate, cooler weather, more mild weather. I wouldn't want to plant something that needs full sun and, a more dry location. So I think it's important to get to know your land, get to know your property before you actually place your garden. Mistake number 2 of what not to do is follow garden trends. Now, I say this with a grain of salt because I do think we can learn a lot from different garden trends. I've learned a lot from garden trends, but I have also found that you have to kind of be cautious. You need to do your research. It's fine to try the trends out in your own garden, but just know that they may not be as successful as what someone's promoting on the internet. It's very easy to believe in something that you're seeing circulating on social media or YouTube or wherever, and it's not actually accurate. So you really want to make sure that you do your research, that you maybe talk to people, other gardeners, and see what their thoughts are, especially seasoned gardeners who've been gardening for a long time. You just want to be cautious. For example, I love the Back to Eden garden method, and this became really popular probably maybe 5-ish years ago, or you might hear it as the no-till garden, and I use this a lot. But I'm actually finding as I become more of a seasoned gardener and I'm trying different methods and different ways of doing things, that I actually like to do a mixture of the Back to Eden no-till garden, but I also need to till some things as well. So I'm kind of trying to find a balance with it. I find that some plants respond better to the no-till Back to Eden garden method, and others respond better to the more traditional farming methods. And I think it also really depends on where you live, what your grow zone is. So be cautious with trends. Yes, we can learn from them, but make sure you do your research first. Mistake number 3 I want to share, and this is something that I have done many times, and that is working too quickly without really knowing what you're doing. So an example of this would be if someone gave you a bunch of free plants and you've never grown this produce or this plant ever before in your life, and you just throw it in the garden and just hope it turns out okay. And you may find that you needed to trellis it, or you needed to stake it, or you shouldn't have planted it near the potatoes. You did things too quickly without doing the proper research and the proper planning ahead. So my advice would be to go slow, Implement things slowly as you've learned them and learn them well. Don't just throw things in the garden for the sake of throwing things in the garden. You want to really make sure that you're doing things methodically. I have found, especially this year, I really scaled back on trying new things. I didn't really try anything new. I just planted the things that I'm really good at growing, and I planted more of it. So my garden is not as diverse this year, but I'm feeling confident in what's being grown because I've grown it so many times. So I think there's something to be said about taking a slower approach to your gardening practices. Don't feel like you have to learn everything all at once. Mistake number 4 is weeding too much. And I know you're probably thinking, how could you weed too much? I feel like I don't weed enough. And that is true. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't weed, because you definitely need to weed the garden. But I'm actually finding that there are times and places when you don't necessarily have to weed at the level that we think we do. For example, I got a gardening book, and I've recommended it before. It's the J-Dom Organic Gardening Book. I'll leave a link in the description box below, but he really teaches you how to work with the natural grasses and letting them grow up in the pathways. So you're keeping it mowed, but you're not removing the weed. And it really does make the gardening a lot less stressful when you learn to work with the weeds. So I've also found too that when I let some of the weeds come up, it actually keeps the ground looser around certain plants. The other thing I've also found is we have a rabbit that has been snitching our strawberries, and when I weed the strawberry plants, the strawberries are more visible and they get eaten. So there was a couple days where we got a really heavy rain and I just couldn't get out there to weed. So the weeds really got ahead of me. And what I found is there was more strawberries, and it's because they were hidden in the weeds and the rabbit couldn't find them. So I've actually just let my strawberry patch get really weedy just so that the strawberries are hidden and we can actually enjoy them. So again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't weed your garden, but I think we should learn to work with the land, work with the natural grasses that grow on your property so that you're not a slave to the whole weeding process. Mistake number 5 is planting things in the wrong spot. Now, this is a common mistake, and it's one of those things that you just kind of have to learn as you go. But I have planted things either in ground that's too hard or too shallow, or I've planted, for example, I planted a hydrangea along my shed, and it's a beautiful place for it, but it doesn't get quite enough sun, so I actually don't get very many blooms. I only get maybe 2 or 3 a year. And so unfortunately, I'm not probably going to get as many flowers as I would prefer in that spot. So make sure that you're doing your research and that you're planting things where they need to. For example, if the plant needs full sun, you need to plant it where there's full sun. So just do your research. Usually the information is on the back of the seed packet. Mistake number 6 is taking on too much at one time. And this kind of goes back to working too quickly, but our first garden that we put in, I wanted to put in this huge, ginormous garden, and it was really big. And because it was our first garden, it was very hard to maintain and keep up with. So our second garden, I actually downsized and made it a little smaller. And so I really have to encourage you to start small. Always start small. Get really good at that small garden, whether it's a couple raised beds or even just a couple planters on your porch. Get really good at maintaining those, and then once you've maintained them for a couple years, then add on. Because I find that if you start too big, you just get overwhelmed and you experience what's called burnout. And you just don't want to do that, especially if you really want to get good at gardening. So always start small, get really good at that small space, and build from there. The 7 biggest mistake that I have experienced, and I'm sure some of you have too, is buying unnecessary garden tools and gadgets. There are so many companies out there promoting their gadget, their tool, saying that you'll spend less time weeding or less time in the garden, you'll achieve more produce. They promise you the world, and you buy this gadget and it either breaks or you find that you don't use it that often. And I have really found that with gardening, the simpler the tools, the better. The only tools I really use in the garden is a rake, a small shovel, and I do use a hand plow from time to time, and that is it. The most important tool is elbow grease, some muscle, and your hands. That is really the most important tools that you need in a garden. You need to be willing to work hard, to break a sweat, and if you're willing to do those things, you don't need fancy tools to have a garden that produces beautiful produce. Mistake number 8, and this is a common one too, and that is growing food that your family doesn't like. This one is a really easy one to do because I think when we get those seed catalogs in January and we're looking through the beautiful, colorful pictures, we see all these beautiful plants and vegetables and fruit, and we just get very inspired to try everything. And we end up trying things that the family or yourself just does not enjoy eating. So I really try to focus on growing only foods that we like to eat. Mistake number 9 is growing plants that are unsuitable for your grow zone. It is very important that you know what grow zone you live in, and then from there you can determine what plants do best in your grow zone. So for example, I'm in grow zone 6, so I cannot grow anything tropical. Maybe if I had a greenhouse, my stepmom has this beautiful sunroom with all these windows and they face the sun most of the day, so she was able to grow a pineapple in there, which was pretty amazing. But where I live and within my home, I just don't have the capacity to do that. So make sure again that you're researching this, because again, you're just wasting time. You're wasting time and money growing things that will never succeed in your grow zone. And the last mistake that is a big one, and I have made it up to today, and I am going to change that. That is my goal for this year, and that is not getting your soil tested. Now, is it absolutely necessary that you get your soil tested? Of course not. People have been growing things for thousands of years and have never gotten their soil tested. But I do think in our modern age, this is a tool that could be extremely helpful for gardeners, because when you get your soil tested, you can see exactly what you're deficient in, which will help mitigate issues that you're seeing in your garden. For example, you might have a certain plant like tomatoes or cucumbers that just don't do well in your space. Or you might be attracting certain pests and diseases that could be eradicated if you fix the soil, because the health of the soil determines the health of the plant. So we need to put that focus into building up rich, nutrient-dense soil, and getting the soil tested is a really good way of doing this. So that's my goal for this year, is to get my soil tested so I can actually see what's going on. So just to recap from these top 10 mistakes that I've made in my garden and my gardening journey, and I'm sure some of you have too, is number 1, always keep an open mind. Always be open to learning. We're always going to continuously learn how to do new things. And one of the best ways to learn is from our mistakes. And just accept the fact that there's going to be mistakes that happen in the garden. Gardening is a lot of trial and error. And I think the important thing is to take that mistake and turn it into something good. Figure out what you need to do different, what you need to change. Maybe you need to do something completely different. Whatever it is, just taking that mistake and building from there, and always trying to improve upon your gardening skills each year. And I think you'll have a successful garden no matter what. I hope today's video is helpful. It's a little different from what we've done. You can also learn all kinds of wonderful gardening skills over at morningchores.com. I will leave a link in the description box below. We'll see you in the next video, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.